tenacious digging of your investigators led to the unraveling of one man's scheme to drug and sexually assault women he met on popular dating apps.
He seemed like the perfect match, a successful cardiologist on a dating app. But women who went out with him say he was a monster who spiked their drinks and then brutally sexually assaulted them.
We do have new details on a serial rapist who drugged nearly a dozen women, sexually assaulted many of them.
I should have never ever even been able to match with him because he should have never been able to make another account.
I got in the hot tub, and the very last thing I remember is just looking at the water and then just lights out.
She was in the shower, half clothed and just making no sense.
The incident was the scariest day of my life. That is the only time that I thought I might die. And when I came out of the restroom, I found him in the kitchen with a drink that he had made for me. I didn't want to offend him, so I took the drink.
This is one of those cases that would send shock waves and chills to your bones. January 30th, 2023 began like thousands of ordinary days across Denver, Colorado. People were heading to work. Coffee shops were opening. Traffic moved through familiar streets. Hospitals prepared for another routine day of patients and emergencies. Nothing about that morning suggested that investigators would eventually begin unraveling allegations that would grow into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations involving a medical professional in the area. Because on that day, a woman identified in court records only as Abby walked into University Hospital carrying something invisible. Not bruises people could immediately see. Not obvious injuries that announced themselves the moment she entered the room. She carried uncertainty, confusion, fear, and perhaps one of the most terrifying questions a person can ever ask themselves. What happened to me? Imagine waking up and realizing pieces of your own life are missing. Not fuzzy memories, not moments you simply forgot. Entire hours. Hours that should exist. Hours that should belong to you. Hours that suddenly feel as though someone reached into your life and tore pages out of the story. Because according to later investigative reporting and court documents, Abby had awakened in her own home with paramedics around her. Think about that for a second. You open your eyes. You see unfamiliar movement. People speaking. Questions being asked. Voices around you. But your mind struggles to catch up. You know where you are. You recognize your home. You recognize the walls, the furniture, the ceiling. But something immediately feels wrong. Very wrong. Because your first instinct isn't relief. It's confusion. How did I get here? How did this happen? What happened after I left? What happened after the date? Because according to the investigation, the last things Abby remembered didn't feel dangerous at all. That's one of the details that makes stories like this so unsettling. Danger rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing familiarity. Weeks earlier, Abby had reportedly matched with Dr. Stephen Matthews on Hinge. Nothing unusual there. Millions of people use dating apps every day. Conversations begin. Messages are exchanged. Strangers become familiar. A profile becomes a person. Weeks of communication can create a sense of comfort, a sense of trust, a feeling that you know somebody. And according to the timeline later presented by investigators, January 29th had started normally. Completely normally. Breakfast, conversation, mimosas, simple moments. The kind of ordinary date people barely think twice about. The date reportedly took place at On and Off Cafe. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed danger. No obvious warning signs. No flashing red lights. Just two people spending time together. Talking, laughing, learning about each other. And after breakfast, according to Abby's account, they continued spending time together and eventually went back to Matthew's nearby condominium. Again, another decision people make every single day. Another ordinary moment. Another ordinary choice. Investigators later said Abby remembered playing Jenga. She remembered entering a hot tub. She remembered specific details. Clear details. Precise details. And then, nothing. Not fading memories. Not fragmented pieces. Nothing. Nearly 10 hours gone. Gone. Imagine trying to explain that feeling. Imagine sitting in a room and realizing that your memory simply ends. Imagine reaching for answers and finding empty space. Because according to reports connected to the investigation, Abby later discovered physical signs on her body, including marks she did not remember receiving. and suddenly something becomes impossible to ignore. Because confusion starts changing into fear. Fear starts changing into questions. Questions start changing into possibilities. And possibilities become terrifying. Because what do you do when your body appears to remember something your mind cannot? What do you do when physical evidence begins telling a story you cannot hear? Most people rely on memory to understand reality. Memory tells us where we've been, what happened, who we spoke to, how we got home. Memory is something we take for granted every single day, until suddenly it isn't there. Until suddenly there is a blank space where your life should be. And according to the timeline that would later emerge, Abby made a decision that many people in similar situations struggle to make. She sought help. She presented herself for a sexual assault nurse examiner evaluation, a SANE examination. These examinations are among the most important pieces of evidence in investigations involving sexual assault allegations. Not because they make assumptions, not because they automatically provide answers, but because they document facts, carefully, methodically, professionally. Evidence collection, physical examination, photographs, documentation, observations, details, pieces of truth gathered while investigators are still trying to understand the larger picture. But imagine sitting in that room. Imagine being Abby in that moment. Because before investigators ever began building timelines, before police reports existed, before Dr. Stephen Matthews would later face charges connected to multiple allegations, before courtrooms, before headlines, before legal arguments, there was just one woman sitting with uncertainty. Just one woman trying to understand why almost 10 hours of her life had disappeared. 10 hours. Think about that. 10 hours is enough time to drive across multiple cities. Enough time to work an entire shift. Enough time to board a flight. Enough time for life-changing events to happen. And for Abby, according to her account, those hours existed somewhere beyond reach. Hidden behind a wall she couldn't see through. And perhaps the most frightening part of all wasn't what she remembered. It was what she didn't. Because when something terrible happens, people often say they wish they could forget. But there is another side to that. Sometimes not remembering becomes its own nightmare. Because the mind starts searching for answers, filling silence with possibilities, asking questions over and over again, questions that refuse to disappear, questions that keep returning at 3 in the morning, questions that sit with you in empty rooms, questions that follow you into every quiet moment. What happened after the hot tub? What happened after the laughter stopped? What happened inside those missing hours? And as investigators would later discover, Abby may not have been the only person asking those questions. Because what began as confusion, what began as fear, what began as one woman's missing hours, would eventually become something much larger, much darker, and much more complicated. Because this was only the beginning. If you follow true crime because you want more than headlines, if you want the evidence, the timeline, the people involved, and the investigative process that reveals how cases develop over time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst. Sharing these stories helps more people understand how investigations unfold, how patterns emerge, and how unanswered questions sometimes lead investigators toward much larger truths. Because in this case, the missing hours were only the first mystery, and the next pieces of the story would raise questions no one expected. The strange thing about dangerous moments is that they rarely feel dangerous when they begin. People imagine life-changing events arriving with warning signs. They imagine dramatic music, obvious red flags, instincts screaming that something is wrong. But in real life, some of the most devastating stories begin with something ordinary. A conversation, a smile, a drink, a decision that felt completely harmless at the time. And according to investigative reports and later court filings involving Dr. Stephen Matthews, January 29, 2023 reportedly began exactly that way for Abby. Normal. Entirely normal. Nothing in the beginning of that day suggested that investigators would eventually spend months trying to understand what happened during a period of time Abby said she could not remember. Because before there were police reports, before there were criminal charges, before additional women would eventually come forward, there was simply a date. According to reports, Abby and Dr. Stephen Matthews had connected through Hinge after communicating for several weeks. And that's important because weeks matter. Weeks create familiarity. Weeks create comfort. People aren't just looking at a profile anymore after weeks of conversation. They're learning favorite foods, favorite shows, personal stories, maybe talking late into the night, maybe sharing things that slowly transform a stranger into someone who feels known. That's how trust works. Trust rarely arrives all at once. It builds quietly, one conversation at a time, one text at a time, one laugh at a time. And according to the timeline later presented, they met for breakfast at On and Off Cafe in Denver. Nothing about that location sounds threatening. Nothing about breakfast sounds threatening. People hear words like breakfast date and imagine sunlight coming through windows, coffee cups on tables, people laughing nearby, a normal setting, a safe setting. According to Abby's account, things felt natural, comfortable. Conversation flowed. There wasn't some explosive argument. There wasn't tension. There wasn't a moment where danger suddenly appeared and announced itself. There was breakfast. There were mimosas. There was time spent getting to know each other. And that's why this part of the story becomes so unsettling. Because if someone had taken a photograph at that exact moment, nothing would have looked unusual. Nothing. No one sitting nearby would have looked over and thought, something terrible is happening. Because sometimes the most frightening stories don't look frightening while they're unfolding. Then came another decision. A decision that people make every day without thinking twice. According to Abby's later account, the date continued after breakfast. They decided to keep spending time together. No alarm bells. No fear. No obvious reason to leave. No obvious reason to suspect anything. They reportedly went back to Matthew's condominium nearby. Again, another ordinary moment. Another normal choice. And according to Abby's account, she remembered details clearly. Very clearly. She remembered playing Jenga. Think about that for a second. Jenga. A simple game. Wooden blocks stacked together. People laughing. Trying not to knock pieces over. Normal moments. Ordinary moments. She remembered entering the hot tub. Again, another completely ordinary detail. Nothing dramatic. Nothing threatening. Nothing unusual. The memories weren't fragmented. They weren't dreamlike. According to her account, they were specific, clear, precise. And then, everything stopped. Not gradually. Not slowly fading. Not becoming blurry. Stopped. Imagine reading a book and suddenly discovering entire chapters have been ripped out. Not one page. Not 2 pages. Entire sections. You turn to the next page expecting the story to continue. And instead there's nothing. Blankness. According to later reports surrounding the investigation, Abby described a memory gap lasting from approximately noon until around 9:40 that evening. Nearly 10 hours. 10 hours. Think about how long that actually is. 10 hours is an entire workday. 10 hours is enough time to drive across states. Enough time for life to completely change. Enough time for events to occur that someone remembers forever. Except according to Abby, those hours didn't exist in her memory. The timeline simply disappeared. And that is where investigators would later begin facing one of the biggest questions in this case. Because memory loss itself creates problems. Major problems. People forget details all the time. People forget conversations. People forget names. People forget where they left their keys. But according to experts cited in discussions around the case, complete memory gaps of this kind raise questions that go beyond simple forgetfulness. Because according to Abby's account, she wasn't describing scattered memories. She wasn't saying, I can't remember one conversation. She wasn't saying, I forgot pieces of the afternoon. She was describing something much larger. A period of life that simply vanished. Imagine trying to put that into words. Imagine trying to explain to someone, I remember laughing. I remember Jenga. I remember getting into a hot tub. Then suddenly I remember nothing. And suddenly I wake up later. Because what happens after that? What does your mind do? Your mind starts trying to rebuild reality. Piece by piece. Question by question. What happened after the hot tub? Who was there? What happened next? How did I leave? Who brought me home? What happened inside those missing hours? And perhaps that's where the fear truly starts. Not when something happens, but when something might have happened and you don't know what it was. Because uncertainty can become its own form of torment. Human beings hate empty spaces. We want answers. We need explanations. We want the story to make sense. But according to Abby's account, there was no story. Only missing pieces. Only silence. Only questions. And investigators would later discover something even more unsettling. Because what initially appeared to be one confusing day, one missing timeline, one woman's unexplained experience, was about to become something larger. much larger. Because while Abby was still trying to understand what had happened, other people would eventually begin speaking. Other names, other accounts, other stories. Stories that investigators later believe contained similarities too significant to ignore. But at this point in the timeline, nobody knew that yet. At this point, there was only uncertainty, only confusion, only a woman trying to understand how a completely normal day had somehow transformed into a mystery. And perhaps somewhere inside that mystery sat a question that would eventually change everything. Was this really an isolated experience? Or was this only the beginning? If you follow cases because you want the full investigative picture, not just headlines, but timelines, evidence, and the deeper questions hidden underneath, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst. Sharing these stories helps bring attention to real cases, real investigations, and the details that often reveal patterns people don't initially see. Because in the next part of this investigation, Abby would decide to seek answers. And the answers she found would raise even more disturbing questions than the one she started with. Hospitals are strange places when you're carrying questions nobody around you can answer. People walk through those doors every day searching for certainty. They come in with pain and leave with a diagnosis. They come in with symptoms and leave with prescriptions. They come in afraid and leave with explanations. At least that's the hope. But according to the timeline surrounding the investigation into Dr. Stephen Matthews, when Abby walked into University Hospital in Denver on January 30th, 2023, she wasn't carrying ordinary questions. She wasn't asking why her stomach hurt. She wasn't asking why she had a fever. She wasn't asking why she felt dizzy. She was trying to understand something much more disturbing. She was trying to understand nearly 10 missing hours of her own life. Think about that feeling for a moment. Imagine sitting in a hospital room where everyone around you is looking for evidence of something your own memory refuses to provide. Imagine knowing pieces of your day. Breakfast, conversation, mimosas, playing Jenga, a hot tub, then absolutely nothing. Then waking up later in your own home. The human brain wants stories to have transitions. We want beginnings that lead naturally into endings. But according to Abby's account, her story no longer had a middle. It was as if someone had removed the center of a movie and left only the opening scene and final frame. And somewhere inside those missing hours sat answers she desperately needed. But there was another reality sitting quietly beside that hope. Sometimes people want answers, until they begin realizing what those answers might reveal. Because according to reports connected to the case, Abby underwent what is known as a sexual assault nurse examiner evaluation, commonly called a SANE examination. These examinations are critical in cases involving allegations of sexual assault because they are designed to document evidence carefully and objectively. Not assumptions, not conclusions, evidence, physical findings, photographs, documentation, observations, timelines, medical facts. And somewhere in that room, Abby sat waiting while medical professionals attempted to piece together something her memory could not provide. Imagine those minutes stretching out. Imagine waiting. Imagine wondering what people were finding. Because uncertainty can be terrifying. But there is something even more frightening. Evidence. Because evidence doesn't care what people hope happened. Evidence doesn't care what people wish had happened. Evidence simply exists. And according to reporting surrounding the investigation, the examination documented evidence indicating sexual activity had occurred. Now stop right there. Because imagine hearing that if you're Abby. Imagine hearing medical findings confirming something happened to your body while still having no memory of how events unfolded. Imagine that collision between reality and blankness. Imagine hearing your own body telling a story your own mind cannot remember. Because suddenly those missing hours stop feeling like a mystery. They start feeling like something else. Something heavier. Something darker. Questions start changing. The question is no longer, why can't I remember? Now the question becomes, what happened while I couldn't remember? That is an entirely different kind of fear. Because according to accounts surrounding the investigation, Abby initially sought anonymity. And that isn't unusual. Many people in situations like this do. Because reporting can feel overwhelming. Reporting means police. Reporting means questions. Reporting means revisiting events you may not even fully remember. Reporting means stepping into a process that can become long, emotionally exhausting, and intensely public. Imagine trying to tell investigators about something you can't completely recall. Imagine trying to explain missing pieces. Imagine worrying that people will ask, "Are you sure? Could you be mistaken? Maybe it was just alcohol?" Because that's where another critical question began emerging: the memory loss itself. According to Abby's account, the gap reportedly stretched from approximately noon until around 9:40 p.m., nearly 10 hours. And discussions surrounding the investigation repeatedly raised an important issue. This wasn't being described as simple forgetfulness. This wasn't, "I forgot details." This wasn't, "Things were fuzzy." According to her account, this was complete absence. And complete absence creates difficult questions. Because according to later reporting and commentary around the case, concerns emerged about whether alcohol alone explained what Abby experienced. Now that's important because investigators had not publicly confirmed specific substances at that stage. And speculation is not evidence. But what investigators did have was a timeline. And they had symptoms. Symptoms that appeared significant enough to create concern. Because according to reports, Abby remembered the beginning of the day clearly. Very clearly. Specific places. Specific activities. Specific moments. Then suddenly there was nothing. And suddenly something that initially looked like confusion started becoming concern. Concern started becoming fear. Fear started becoming a decision. Because several days later, according to the investigation timeline, Abby made a choice that would change everything. On February 6, 2023, she contacted Denver police and formally identified herself. And that decision transformed the situation from a medical mystery into a criminal investigation. Think about what that moment probably felt like. Because making that phone call isn't just making a phone call. Making that phone call means crossing a line. A line between uncertainty and action. A line between private pain and public investigation. A line between asking yourself questions and asking law enforcement to begin asking them too. And once that happens, things begin moving. Detectives begin collecting statements. Timelines begin forming. Witnesses begin getting interviewed. Text messages begin getting reviewed. And investigators begin searching for inconsistencies. Because once police become involved, every detail matters. Every minute, every location, every conversation, every drink, every message, everything. And according to reports surrounding the case, investigators later interviewed Dr. Stephen Matthews on February 14th, Valentine's Day. The timing itself almost feels surreal. Because while many people spent that day celebrating relationships and trust, investigators were sitting down with a cardiologist facing questions surrounding events that allegedly occurred weeks earlier. According to police reports, Matthews acknowledged that Abby had consumed alcohol at his residence. Reports indicated he described her drinking a larger mimosa followed by tequila shots. According to his account, intimate activity had been consensual. He also reportedly stated Abby later became ill and vomited before eventually leaving in an Uber. Now here's where things became more complicated. Because investigators were no longer looking at a simple contradiction. That's what made this difficult. Matthews' account didn't necessarily eliminate every fact investigators already had. Instead, it created even more questions. Because legal and medical questions began colliding. Criminal defense attorney Kathleen Bogan later discussed an issue investigators often confront in cases involving severe intoxication and consent. According to Bogan's analysis, meaningful consent becomes legally complicated if someone is impaired to a degree where cognition and awareness are significantly affected. And suddenly investigators faced another uncomfortable question. If someone becomes severely impaired, if someone is vomiting, if someone later experiences significant memory loss, what exactly was happening inside that timeline? Because every answer now seemed to create another question. Every step forward seemed to reveal another shadow. And investigators still weren't aware of something else that would eventually change the trajectory of the entire case. Because at this stage, Abby likely believed she was telling investigators about one experience, one incident, one timeline, one day. But according to what investigators would later discover, other women would soon begin coming forward. Other names, other stories, other dates. And when investigators started placing those accounts beside one another, they would begin noticing details that were impossible to ignore. Details that would transform one allegation into something investigators believed might represent a much larger pattern. But at this point in the story, that hadn't happened yet. At this point, there was still only uncertainty, still only questions, still one woman trying to understand 10 missing hours. Because sometimes answers don't bring peace. Sometimes answers simply open doors. And behind those doors wait even darker questions than the ones you started with. For investigators in Denver, Colorado, it looked like a major step forward. For Abby, it may have felt like the moment questions finally started moving toward answers. And for Dr. Stephen Matthews, according to court records and reporting surrounding the case, it became the day the investigation shifted into an entirely different phase. Because on that day, Matthews was arrested on 3 felony sexual assault charges connected to Abby's allegations. But what investigators would later discover is that sometimes an arrest doesn't close a story. Sometimes it opens one. And sometimes the moment law enforcement takes action is the exact moment other people begin asking themselves a question they had been afraid to ask for years. Wait, could this have happened to me too? Because before this point, Abby's account existed as one timeline. One woman, one missing period of memory, one set of allegations, one investigation. But patterns are strange things. Patterns often remain invisible until somebody places multiple pieces beside each other. One piece alone can look accidental. 2 pieces can feel coincidental. 3 pieces begin creating discomfort. 4 pieces begin creating questions. 5 pieces force people to stop looking away. And according to the investigative timeline, only days after Matthews' arrest, something started happening. Phones started ringing. New names started appearing. New stories started emerging. Stories from women who had never met each other. Women from different places. Women with different lives. Different experiences. Different personalities. And yet investigators reportedly began noticing similarities that were difficult to ignore. On March 27th, according to reports, a woman identified publicly only as Bailey contacted Denver police. Her experience allegedly involved Dr. Stephen Matthews and reportedly occurred on January 25, 2023. For days before Abby's alleged encounter. For days. Think about that. While Abby was still trying to understand the missing pieces in her own timeline, another woman was reportedly carrying questions of her own. Questions she had not yet brought to law enforcement. Questions that perhaps stayed in the back of her mind. Questions that many people in situations like this ask themselves. Was I overreacting? Did I misunderstand something? Would anyone believe me? Was it just alcohol? Because uncertainty can silence people. Sometimes people don't stay silent because they aren't afraid. Sometimes people stay silent because they're trying to convince themselves there is nothing to say. But according to reports surrounding the investigation, Bailey described a series of events that investigators reportedly found concerning. According to her account, there had been a connection through Hinge. A date. Returning to Matthews' condominium. Drinks after arriving. Then allegedly a rapid onset of severe impairment. Then memory loss. Pause there. Because that's where investigators reportedly began noticing similarities. Not conclusions. Not proof. Patterns. Patterns are different. Patterns don't automatically determine guilt. But patterns do create investigative interest. And then Bailey's account reportedly introduced another element. Something investigators would likely view as significant. She reportedly recalled Matthews filming portions of the encounter while she appeared impaired. Filming. That single detail creates entirely new questions. Because investigators now potentially weren't just dealing with witness accounts and timelines. They could potentially be dealing with digital evidence. And digital evidence changes things. Witnesses can forget details. People can remember events differently. Time can affect memory. But digital evidence creates another category entirely. Digital evidence can preserve moments. Digital evidence can establish timelines. Digital evidence can answer questions. But it can also create more of them. Because investigators would now have to ask, if recordings existed, where were they? Did they still exist? Were they stored somewhere? Deleted? Shared? Recovered? Or were investigators searching for evidence that no longer existed? Because once investigators begin dealing with phones, videos, photographs, and digital records, cases become much larger, much more complicated, much more unpredictable. And perhaps what made all of this even more unsettling was timing. Because Bailey's alleged encounter reportedly occurred before Abby's, which meant investigators could not simply ask, what happened to Abby? Now they had to ask, could something larger have been happening? That is an entirely different investigation. Because now investigators aren't looking at one event. They're looking at possibility. Possibility of repetition. Possibility of methodology. Possibility of behavior extending beyond a single allegation. And then something happened that reportedly accelerated everything. Within a very short period of time after Matthews' arrest, additional women allegedly began coming forward. Think about what that says psychologically. Because many people who experience traumatic or confusing situations often believe they are alone. Alone in confusion. Alone in doubt. Alone in uncertainty. Then suddenly another story appears. Then another. Then another. And suddenly isolation begins disappearing. Because now people start hearing details that sound familiar. Too familiar. Imagine sitting at home and seeing coverage of a case. Imagine hearing somebody describe a dating app, drinks, memory gaps, confusion, waking up later with missing pieces, and suddenly feeling your stomach drop. Because you're not hearing a stranger's story anymore. You're hearing pieces of your own. And maybe for the first time you begin wondering, was my experience actually something more? That possibility alone is enough to change everything. Because people often imagine investigations moving in straight lines. Crime happens. Police investigate. Arrest happens. Case closed. Real investigations rarely work that way. Real investigations grow. Real investigations evolve. Real investigations suddenly shift directions. And sometimes investigators discover they were standing at the edge of something much larger without realizing it. If you're following this investigation and appreciate fact-based breakdowns that focus on evidence, timelines, and how real criminal investigations evolve over time, take a second to support Apex Crime Analyst. Like this video, subscribe, and most importantly share it. Sometimes people recognize details, timelines, and patterns only after hearing the full story. Your support helps us continue breaking down complex cases beyond the headlines. Because at this point, investigators were likely asking difficult questions. Questions with no immediate answers. Questions that become more important with every additional account. How many people had interacted with Dr. Stephen Matthews through dating platforms? How many encounters had occurred? How many people never reported anything? How many people questioned their own experiences and decided to remain silent? How many people explained away missing details? Because uncertainty has a way of convincing people not to trust themselves. People say, maybe I drank too much. Maybe I just forgot. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe nothing happened. But then another account appears. Then another. And eventually similarities become difficult to ignore. Because now investigators reportedly weren't simply seeing Hinge, drinks, memory loss. Now they were seeing timing, behavior, repeated circumstances, repeated environments, repeated patterns of contact. And investigators know something important. Patterns matter. Not because patterns prove guilt, but because patterns often reveal where investigators should look next. And at this point, according to reports, investigators were only beginning to understand the potential scope of what they were dealing with. Because the most disturbing part may not have been the allegations themselves. The most disturbing part may have been the possibility that investigators still hadn't found everyone. That possibility changes everything. Because if additional people existed, then somewhere out there, someone may still have been carrying unanswered questions. Someone may still have been replaying missing memories. Someone may still have been trying to explain away confusion. Someone may still have believed they were completely alone. And investigators were about to discover that the stories coming forward weren't simply similar. Some of them were almost unsettlingly familiar. Different names, different dates, different women, yet details that appeared to repeat again and again. And in the next stage of this investigation, those similarities would begin creating a picture investigators could no longer ignore. Because what initially looked like isolated allegations was beginning to resemble something else entirely. A pattern. April 19th and April 20th, 2023. 2 dates. 24 hours. And according to reporting surrounding the investigation into Dr. Stephen Matthews, what happened during that short window may have changed the entire direction of the case. Because until this point, investigators in Denver had been gathering accounts one by one. Individual statements. Individual timelines. Individual allegations. Abby had come forward. Bailey had come forward. Investigators were already comparing details, already searching for consistencies, already asking difficult questions. But then something happened that investigators pay close attention to. The calls started clustering, one after another. 3 additional women reportedly contacted law enforcement within roughly a single day. And suddenly investigators weren't staring at isolated pieces anymore. They were staring at a picture that was beginning to form. Because sometimes patterns don't emerge slowly. Sometimes they appear all at once. Imagine sitting inside an investigative office late at night. Files spread across a desk. Timelines hanging on whiteboards. Names, dates, places, digital records, interviews. Investigators trying to understand where each piece belongs. Then another report arrives. Then another. Then another. And suddenly details that once seemed random begin lining up. Not perfectly, but close enough to make people stop and look harder. Because according to reports surrounding the case, investigators were now hearing accounts from women identified publicly as Cassie, Daisy, and Emma. Different people, different backgrounds, different lives. Yet according to reports, similarities reportedly began appearing in ways that were difficult to ignore. Cassie's account reportedly followed a familiar path. According to reporting, she had connected with Dr. Stephen Matthews through Hinge. Again, investigators reportedly heard about online communication. Again, investigators reportedly heard about meeting in person. Again, there was discussion involving alcohol. And according to her account, after consuming what she believed to be tequila at Matthews' residence, she reportedly experienced complete memory loss. Complete. Not confusion. Not fuzzy recollection. Nothing. That word had appeared before. Nothing. The absence of memory had already surfaced in earlier allegations. And now investigators reportedly heard it again. Different woman. Different day. Same frightening reality. Because memory gaps create something that investigators and victims both struggle with. Missing space. Missing space means missing answers. How did I get home? What happened after that? Who was there? What happened inside the missing hours? Those questions have no easy response when memory itself disappears. And then investigators reportedly heard Daisy's account. According to reports, Daisy met Matthews through Tinder rather than Hinge. At first glance, that might not seem important. But investigators often pay attention to differences just as much as similarities. Because differences can tell you whether you're looking at a repeated process or simply coincidence. According to reporting, Daisy said Matthews convinced her to come back to his apartment to see the view. The view. Think about how ordinary that sounds. How harmless that sounds. No threatening language. No dramatic setup. Just a casual suggestion. Just another everyday decision. According to reports, drinks followed on the rooftop. Again, another ordinary detail. Thousands of people meet for drinks every day. Thousands of people visit apartments every day. Thousands of people continue dates after initial meetings every day. Nothing by itself appears alarming. Then according to Daisy's account, she later regained awareness around 1 in the morning in Matthew's bed. And according to reports, she reportedly remembered only vague images of him being on top of her. Vague images. Fragments. Small pieces. Not complete memory. Not understanding. Just pieces. And perhaps that's one of the cruelest parts of situations involving alleged memory impairment. Because fragments can become torture. You remember enough to feel fear, but not enough to feel certainty. Enough to ask questions, not enough to answer them. And then investigators reportedly heard Emma's account. And Emma introduced something investigators may not have expected. Because according to reports, Emma also met Matthews through Hinge. The interaction reportedly involved inappropriate physical contact while in a hot tub. But according to reporting, Emma left. She left the encounter. And at first glance, that might seem different from the others. Until investigators reportedly learned what happened afterward. Because according to reports, Emma later realized Dr. Stephen Matthews was allegedly the same person who had done this to her friend about 3 years ago. 3 years. Stop there for a moment. 3 years. Because suddenly the timeline investigators had been examining no longer looked confined to weeks or months. Now there was a possibility the allegations stretched much further backward. And that possibility changes everything. Because investigators immediately start asking new questions. If people recognized him, how long had conversations existed? How many stories had circulated privately? How many warnings had stayed inside social circles instead of reaching police? How many women had told close friends, but never made official reports? Because people don't always go directly to law enforcement. Sometimes they tell a roommate. Sometimes they tell a best friend. Sometimes they tell a sister. Sometimes they tell nobody. And if Emma reportedly recognized Matthews because of something involving her friend years earlier, investigators now had another disturbing possibility sitting in front of them. What if the reports they had received represented only a fraction of what actually existed? That possibility may be one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case. Because every investigation has visible victims, and then there are invisible ones. The people who never call, the people who never report, the people who convince themselves to stay quiet, the people who decide moving forward feels easier than reopening old wounds. And investigators know something important. When multiple people begin coming forward after public arrests or media coverage, those individuals often aren't hearing information for the first time. They're hearing confirmation. Confirmation that they may not be alone. Confirmation that maybe what happened wasn't in their imagination. Confirmation that maybe the questions they've carried for months or years deserve answers. By this stage of the investigation involving Dr. Stephen Matthews, investigators reportedly were no longer looking at scattered allegations sitting separately on a desk. Now they reportedly had names, patterns, timelines, repeated circumstances, repeated environments, repeated themes. And the deeper investigators looked, the more one question continued growing larger. Was this becoming a pattern too significant to ignore? Because the next phase of the investigation would move beyond dating apps and missing memories. Investigators would begin asking whether another factor may have existed beneath all of it. Something far more disturbing. Something connected to Dr. Stephen Matthews himself. And that possibility would take the investigation into even darker territory. As the investigation into Dr. Stephen Matthews continued expanding, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The case was no longer centered on a single allegation, a single date, or a single encounter. According to court records and reporting surrounding the investigation, what had initially begun with Abby's missing hours had reportedly developed into multiple cases involving multiple women and multiple allegations across separate timelines. And when investigations reach that stage, the focus begins changing. Early on, investigators often ask a simple question: what happened? But later, as more information appears, the question becomes much larger. How did this continue for so long? Because according to reporting surrounding the case, investigators and legal analysts were no longer looking only at dating timelines and individual accounts. They were reportedly also examining broader issues, questions involving systems, oversight, and possible gaps that may have existed long before criminal allegations became public. One of those questions involved Dr. Stephen Matthews' professional background, because Matthews was not simply someone women allegedly met through dating applications. He was a cardiologist, a physician, a medical professional, someone trained extensively in human physiology and medicine, someone who occupied a position many people naturally associate with trust. And that detail introduced difficult questions investigators and legal experts reportedly discussed publicly. Because according to commentary surrounding the case, several women had reportedly mentioned Matthews referencing his medical background during interactions. Now that detail alone does not establish wrongdoing. But in an investigation where allegations involve claims of severe impairment and memory gaps, investigators naturally begin examining every surrounding factor. Criminal defense attorney Kathleen Bogan discussed one aspect investigators might potentially explore: whether subpoena records and prescription histories could provide useful information during the investigation. Again, that does not imply conclusions. Investigators examine possibilities. They examine access. They examine timelines. They examine opportunities. Because investigations are not built on assumptions. They are built on evidence. And yet, even beyond the allegations themselves, another issue reportedly began drawing attention: the systems surrounding Matthews. Because according to reporting involving medical oversight discussions, Dr. Pyle Coley explained that many people misunderstand how physician licensing systems actually work. People often imagine continuous monitoring, automatic alerts, immediate suspensions, constant oversight. But according to discussions surrounding the case, medical licensing systems often involve self-reporting structures. And according to reporting, Matthews reportedly renewed his medical license in April of 2023, while criminal proceedings were still ongoing and unresolved. Again, this does not suggest wrongdoing within the licensing process itself. but it raised broader questions. How quickly do systems react? How effectively do institutions communicate? How much depends on voluntary disclosure? Because once public attention shifted toward those questions, the case stopped being solely about one investigation. Now people were asking questions about larger systems. And there was another issue creating concern: dating platforms. According to reporting surrounding the case, women had allegedly reported Matthews to dating applications before criminal charges became public. One of the most discussed examples involved a woman identified publicly as Holly. According to reports, Holly alleged experiencing an incident in 2020 and said she reported Matthews to Hinge. The platform reportedly informed her he had been permanently banned. But according to reporting, Holly later discovered Matthews had allegedly appeared again through another account. And suddenly, another uncomfortable question appeared. What happens if safety systems are easy to bypass? Because millions of people use dating applications. Millions. People trust systems designed to create safer experiences. Reporting systems, account restrictions, permanent bans, protective measures. But if users can allegedly create entirely new accounts using different credentials, investigators and observers naturally begin asking whether those safeguards are enough. And perhaps that is one of the larger stories hidden underneath this investigation. Because the Dr. Stephen Matthews case was never only about allegations. It also became a conversation about systems, medical systems, digital systems, oversight systems, safety systems, and whether those systems respond effectively when warning signs begin appearing. Because according to court reporting, Matthews eventually faced multiple felony charges across multiple cases. But even with charges filed and proceedings underway, major questions still reportedly remained unanswered. Questions investigators had not publicly answered. Questions the public still did not fully understand. Questions like, were specific substances involved? Were digital recordings recovered? How many additional people, if any, had not yet come forward? How many experiences remained unreported? And perhaps most importantly, what was the full scope of the investigation? Because sometimes investigations create answers, and sometimes they create even larger questions. The reality of true crime investigations is that people often expect immediate conclusions. They expect certainty. They expect quick resolutions. But real cases rarely unfold that way. Real investigations move slowly. Evidence takes time. Court proceedings take time. Witnesses take time. And truth itself sometimes takes time. For the women who reportedly came forward in this case, their decisions brought allegations into public view and contributed to an investigation that expanded significantly beyond its original scope. For investigators, every new statement reportedly became another piece of a larger puzzle. And for the public, the case created larger discussions about trust, accountability, and the institutions people depend on every day. Because perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story isn't necessarily the allegations alone. Perhaps it is the possibility that warning signs may exist quietly around us more often than we realize. And perhaps sometimes those warning signs only become visible after separate stories finally begin connecting. As of this stage, legal proceedings involving Dr. Stephen Matthews continued, and allegations remained subject to the court process. Because in the end, this story began with missing hours. Hours one woman could not explain. Hours that reportedly raised questions. Hours that eventually led investigators toward a much larger picture. But the final answers were never found in those missing hours alone. They emerged from patterns, from timelines, from people willing to come forward, and from investigators attempting to understand how separate pieces might fit together. For Apex Crime Analyst, this has been an in-depth examination of an ongoing true crime investigation involving Dr. Stephen Matthews, the allegations surrounding the case, and the broader questions that emerged around it. If you follow true crime because you want more than headlines, if you want timelines, evidence, investigative developments, and the deeper questions behind real cases, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps bring attention to ongoing investigations and helps others discover the stories that continue long after news coverage ends. Because investigations don't end when cameras stop recording. Sometimes that's where the real questions begin.